Welcome to Ground Rules, Employment Law Over Your Coffee Break. My name's Pam Howland, and I'm here today with Jennifer Walrath and Doug Plass, who are also attorneys with Idaho Employment Lawyers. And we have a special guest here today with us, Mike Taylor of Pinnacle. So I met Mike probably, I would say 4 or 5 years ago, probably 4 years ago through Entrepreneurs Organization, and started just building a friendship with Mike really because he was helping other entrepreneurs get their business up and running. And a few years ago, we started using Mike as a consultant through Pinnacle Business, and Mike has been helping us ever since. So today we're going to explore somewhat of an intersection. So the benefits and some concepts related to performance and coaching. And then we're going to talk about how those intersect with some employment law issues that we run across all the time in our practice. But before I do that, I want to tell you a little bit more about Mike. So Mike is the Chief Vision Officer at TaylorMade Visioneering. He brings a wealth of experience and insight into the role, and Mike has a really interesting business background and history, as he at one time owned one of the largest commercial furniture dealerships in the United States. After retiring in 2017, he transitioned to a new chapter, becoming a Pinnacle business guide with his firm, TaylorMade Visioneering. So in that capacity, Mike works with organizations generating between $1 million and $100 million in revenue and helps them navigate growth and achieve the vision for their business that they had when they became a business owner. So with that, let's jump in a little bit. And I think we'll kind of start it out, Mike, talking a little bit about how performance factors into employment law and some of the issues that we bump into in really almost every case, because I would say performance management, coaching, and documentation might be one of the most important things that business leaders need to be thinking about, not just in order to grow and become a better business, but in order to avoid claims and lawsuits too. So, one thing that we hear a lot is Idaho's an at-will employment state. So why do we need to worry about documentation? And if we have a bad performer, some clients have asked us before, why can't we just fire them? Why do we need to coach, manage, document any of that good stuff in an at-will state? And just to get the conversation going at its highest level, really the answer to that is because even in an at-will employment state, an employer still has to prove that they did what they did, whether it's terminating someone, disciplining someone, demoting someone. They have to be able to prove that they did what they did for legitimate, non-discriminatory reasons at the end of the day. That's why documentation, coaching, performance management, all of that factors in to risk on the employment law side of the house. So we'll circle back to some of these employment law concepts. But Mike, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you do in your work at TaylorMade Visioneering when it comes to performance and coaching and how that plays into the work that you do with leaders and entrepreneurs?
Yes, the best way to explain that is when I get in engagement with a client, I typically, we focus a lot at Pinnacle. I'm looking at the Pinnacle flywheel right now, and at the top of our flywheel is people. I feel it's the most important thing that we can work on in this organization. It's your most expensive asset, and your most valuable asset, and some people just overlook that. So at the Pinnacle flywheel, we at the top we focus on people, and next in the flywheel is purpose. We want to make sure that your people are aligned with your purpose. And then at the bottom of the flywheel is playbooks. And we want to make sure that everybody is really singing from the same sheet of music and everybody's following the processes and playbooks we have in place. And at the other end of the flywheel is performance. And I think what happens with organizations is they hire someone in, first of all, when they don't do a good job of hiring. I call it panic hiring. I call it panic hiring. They need a position, so they'll bring someone in. But at Pinnacle, what we do is we really want you to focus on making sure you hire the right who. And that's making sure you look at understand the core values of that person you're going to bring on, make sure that they're a good core value fit with the organization. You can hire someone from skill for skill, and you can coach them on skill, but it's very difficult to coach them up into the right with their core values. Either they have the core values fit for the organization or they don't. So as a coach, I focus a lot on the people side of the business, and I think people don't want to take the time to coach an employee up into the right. They don't want to take the time to mentor them, and I think that's when an employer gets into trouble. Is they wait to the end of the year, do the employee employment review at the end of the year. It's hard to go back 9 or 10 months and look at what they did in January when you're doing a review in November, December. And so at Pinnacle, we recommend that you do a quarterly coaching conversation. And that's a conversation that's a two-way conversation. Understand from the employee what they feel has gone well the last 30, 90 days and where they feel they have improvement that they need to make. And so we focus on the quarterly coaching conversation. And then out of that, we like to see you put together a personal improvement plan for each employee. And the purpose behind that is to really grow that individual in the organization so that they become what we call an A player. They become a valuable person in the organization. But typically, employers don't like to put that time and effort in. And I think that's when they get into trouble. If you have an issue with an employee, you're you're not addressing that issue in a timely manner. And you're waiting, at the end of the year. And what happens if you got an issue with an employee, a lot of supervisors and managers, they like to ignore it. They don't want to deal with it. It's a crucial conversation that they don't like to have. It's a hard conversation that they know they need to have, but people tend to push that off. And what happens is that small issue with that employee grows into a major issue at the end. And then at the end, you're trying to go back and pick the pieces up. Why didn't you address this 9 months ago? Why did you not address this 6 months ago? And what happens when you finally address this with an employee, it just blows up. The employee's upset. Why didn't you let me know? My performance was low, 9 months ago. Why is it happening now? And a small issue just tends to grow over time to a large issue. And so we really like to focus on quarterly coaching conversations. The other thing that I recommend to clients I work with, if you see an employee do something that you know is against core values, address it right in the moment. Don't wait 2 days, don't wait 3 days. Address it in the moment. Have that conversation with the employees. That way it's fresh in their mind. They can go, oh, I do remember I did that. If you address that 3 weeks, 2 weeks later, they're not going to remember what happened. They're not remembering what context that happened. And so I encourage supervisors and leaders to address the issues in the moment.
So Jennifer and Doug, maybe you guys jump in. Have you seen in your practice what goes wrong when employers don't do the coaching, the management, and when things blow up, how that spins into employment law claims?
Well, certainly, yes. And I was thinking there's kind of two things. Sometimes it's that they haven't done the things that Mike was just talking about at all. And other times they've done those things but didn't document that they did them. And I think both of those can create problems. For one thing, as Mike mentioned, it can really upset employees. So, they might be more inclined to pursue a claim if they've got a basis for one against the employer, if they leave or if they get fired or something else, adverse happens to them. But probably the most common issue that I have seen is, an employer comes to me and says, I want to fire this employee. They've been performing so badly and it's time to let them go. But then you find out that that employee maybe is going to counseling for a mental health issue, or has recently asked for like a disability accommodation, or maybe they are the only female employee in a team of otherwise male employees. And then if you ask that employer, okay, you say this person performed poorly, do you have documentation of that? And find out that the last time there's anything written down about that employee's poor performance was 6 months ago. It just looks like it's not a legitimate reason. It may well be. There may not be any doubt that the employer is telling the truth and there really have been issues, but if they haven't been written down or haven't been addressed, it makes it a lot harder for the employer to show they had a legitimate reason for example, firing the employee, and a lot easier for the employee to argue that the reason they got fired was an unlawful reason, like discrimination or harassment or retaliation because they asked for an accommodation, things like that.
And not only is it easier for them to argue that, they're way more likely to believe it themselves, right? So they have this recent thing that has happened that's somehow related to their protective class status or something else, and some other nebulous things that they never found out about until right now. They're like, why are you telling me this now? Well, it's obviously because of what I just brought up, so that we see that over and over again. The employee doesn't think anything's wrong. The employer has all sorts of problems, and something happens. The employee gets let go, or the employer wants to let them go, and the dam breaks, basically.
Yeah, and I would add, so Jennifer had 3 categories of things, or two categories of things that she thought gave rise to claims in the employment law setting. When someone doesn't do the coaching or when they don't document it, I'm going to add a third one, which is when maybe they put something in writing, but they put stuff in writing that actually is more harmful than helpful. And we've had a handful of cases like that where maybe an employer does an annual review. Maybe the supervisor doesn't really want to do it, but that's the way the employer is set up in order for people to get their annual cost of living raise. So the supervisor doesn't really put a lot of time and effort into it, and they say, this employee's doing a great job, exceeds expectations, even though that might not be the case. Bad reviews that don't accurately reflect what's going on can definitely be more harmful than helpful. And we have seen that in a handful of cases. So we've also seen cases where you have a supervisor who is sincerely trying to do a good review, but maybe they just haven't received enough basic employment law training to know that you don't put things like protected class status information in the review. So we had a case a couple years ago that involved a supervisor who was trying to manage the performance of a woman who reported to him. She ultimately got terminated and brought a claim for gender discrimination. And in support of her claim, she cited to the performance review her boss had done, which said that she was doing a good job except for those months when she was gone on maternity leave, right? So calling out a protected class, never a good idea in documentation. So definitely putting the wrong type of information or sugarcoating it can lead to problems. And another thing Mike kept saying, I heard Mike say this a couple times, which 100% I agree is so valuable, is when you're really addressing a situation contemporaneously when the problem happens. So not like stockpiling information in a drawer so that you can tackle it later, but raising the issue at the time it occurs, having the conversation, and working through it then.
Yeah, one of the things that all my clients hear me say a lot is the word clarity. And it's, clarity in the job description. I look at a lot of job descriptions and I don't feel like that they're not clear. you'll read a job description and it has, 30 lines, and at the end it says, and what else is deemed necessary for you to do your work? Well, it's like, who knows what that is? So I'm really big on creating clarity for the job descriptions. I call it something different. I call it the three obsessions and the results ownership. To me, each employee, when they wake up in the morning and come to work, there's three things that they should obsess over. And those are the three most important things they need to do for, to complete their work. And then the results is, what results do they own? And make that crystal clear. That way they're crystal clear on what results they own. And that way it's not, it just can't be, misunderstood between the supervisor and the employee. The other thing I see when I work with organizations and I come in and I ask to take a look at their org chart, sometimes they go, well, we don't have one. And to me, it's like, well, who reports to who? That's a fundamental issue that has to be resolved, because if you have an employee and they don't know who they report to, then they're probably not going to get the reviews correctly that they're supposed to get. And so one of the first things I do is help the team build out what I call a results ownership chart. It's a regular ownership chart, but we really tie it back to results. And I just feel like that every seat in that org chart has to have complete clarity. Number one, on the job description. Number two, on the reporting structure. And I've got some teams I work with where it's with a CPA firm, and because they've got partners and different senior managers, the staff doesn't know who they report to. And you go to the senior manager and they go, I don't know that I'm supposed to be doing that, the performance review. So that when you don't have clarity in that, it just causes confusion for the employee. And then when you get confusion, then that's when you probably end up in court, because that confusion just starts to build up over time. So I believe in clarity in the reporting structure and clarity in the job description. I think that clears a lot of things up.
Yeah, and those are great points for any business that's growing. I think those are huge challenges, right? Like, do we have an org chart? Maybe not. Hopefully we will. But as you grow, I think some of those details maybe aren't as straightforward as you wish they were. Like, so who is going to supervise this role? So I totally get that. And I think at the end of the day, your underlying point there about making sure expectations are clearly spelled out, that is like the heart of employment law, right? Because if people feel like they're not being treated fairly and they don't have notice of their expectations, that is the recipe for disaster.
And a lot of times too, it comes back to the quarterly coaching conversation, because I firmly believe that every quarterly coaching conversation should be followed up with a personal improvement plan. Everybody has room for improvement, even an A player. There are things that the A player is going to say, I need to improve on this. And so I think every quarterly coaching conversation should be followed up with a personal improvement plan. The other thing I recommend for, a little bit larger firms is a mentorship program inside the organization. And I like that because you team employees up. Typically, you take one manager and maybe a staff, and you have this mentor program, and it's really to help them as individuals grow inside the organization. And when I work with an organization to set up that mentorship program, there are a lot of guidelines and rules and kind of legal things that we make sure we put in there. One is when you start that relationship and the mentor conversation, is everything said in that conversation is 100% confidential. But I do let them know, as whoever the mentor is, there are certain things that a person may say that absolutely have to be, you know, put to management. If they've been sexually harassed, if anything like that has happened, that is not confidential. They have to take that, they have to report that to management. If anything legal it as arises in that mentor conversation, they have a responsibility to bring that to management. But I think what happens when you have those mentor conversations, that employee learns to trust this mentor, and that mentor has the ability to raise that person up and move them up into the right and grow as an individual. I think it's our job as leaders is to grow other leaders. That to me is our job. Our job is not to criticize, it's to grow leaders. Leaders are to grow leaders. And I think if you focus on that, growing leaders, I think a lot of the issues go away because you have a different feeling towards that person when you know that you have the responsibility to grow them as a leader, grow them as an employee, grow them as a human being. If you treat people like that, I think you're going to stay out of court, because you're going to build this level of trust with people. And when issues are starting to happen in an organization, they're going to be more apt to bring that to you and let you know that something's going on inside the organization.
I was just thinking, Mike, as you were talking, both now and when you first started earlier in the podcast, about sort of the practical challenge of spending the time on this, that it's important. And I was wondering if you have found anything in particular to be effective in convincing your clients that this is worthwhile to spend the time, and maybe some tools for how they might learn how to really do this effectively.
Yeah, I think the quarterly coaching conversation is the best tool. And when I introduce that, I can see the look on the leaders in the room, when I'm in my first base camp with them. And they're like, oh my gosh, another tool, another thing I have to do. I don't want to do this, because it's a somewhat of a formal um, uh, conversation. I think there's 8 questions that you ask the employee. What happened the last 90 days that went well? Because you want to celebrate that. You want to make sure that you celebrate what they're doing well. I think there's another 8 questions is, what do you think you could do better? What did not go as well as you anticipated? And what we do is I ask you to, ask the leader to give that to the employee 2 weeks ahead of time. Let them fill it out. They're gonna put in what they want to celebrate. They know what they need to work on. They typically do. And so what happens, so that comes back to you, you do the same. The leader also fills that out. There's also a graph there where we score them on a culture fit, 0 to 10, and a productivity fit 0 to 10. And so, if you're an 8 out of an 8, you're kind of an A player. If you're a 9 out of 9, you're an A player. If you're a 3 out of a 3, you're a C player. The goal is to take that C player, a 3 out of a 3, and get them to a 6, and then get them to an 8, and then get them to a 9. That's our goal over time with the quarterly coaching conversation, is to get them up into the right. And what happens is after about the third quarter that I work with a team, they come back and they go, oh my gosh, Mike, that tool is the best tool. We had the greatest conversation with that employee, the employee that we were having trouble with. It was a positive conversation. It wasn't negative, that, nobody was upset. Because it's the employee is getting to weigh in. If they weigh in on the issues, they're going to buy in. And if they weigh in, they're going to buy in on that personal improvement plan. And so to me, it's the best tool that Pinnacle uses, is a quarterly coaching conversation.
I like that. And we've used it. And I think different types of coaching documents can get a positive result. But what I love about the one you're talking about is it really gets everybody engaged in a back and forth with some positive, negative, and it gives you the bigger questions to ask to kind of guide that. So I like it a lot.
I do think, too, invariably, conversations, there are crucial conversations you have to have with employees, and they're hard. Your emotions get involved, your blood pressure goes up, you're upset about something. And one of the things that I do is I really like to teach my clients how to have those crucial conversations. And because I think if you can teach your managers or supervisors how to have those crucial conversations, they don't escalate. They don't end up in litigation. And it's not easy to do. I mean, it takes months and months and months of, sitting in a conference room, learning how to have those crucial conversations. It's your body language. It's the language you use, the words you use. You want to put yourself in that person's shoes that you're talking to. If I was having that conversation with me, how would I want the words to be used? How would I want the inflection to be? It's an art to have crucial conversations. I'm not that good at it. I teach it, but I'm not that good because I'm a very emotional person and my emotions get the better of me. And crucial conversations teach you how to get those emotions and put those down. Kind of put your emotions on the other person is like put yourself in the other person's shoes. So I think teaching supervisors how to have those crucial conversations is crucial.
So yeah, so Doug, what do you see as far as why supervisors sometimes just bypass the whole process altogether?
Yeah, I think supervisors can be afraid of these things. I think that uh, one objection we see a lot is that, well, I just don't have time for that. I'm too busy doing my job. I'm too busy running the organization. I don't have time to like spend my time sitting down with every employee all the time and having these kind of conversations. Um, Others are really just afraid of conflict. I mean, I think we all are to a certain degree, afraid of what the reaction is going to be, afraid of what you're going to do when you get the negative reaction from the person you're talking to. There can be a lack of confidence in your position. I mean, if you are insecure about your own role and your own work, like you're going to project that on the other person, and that's going to get in the way of it. Sometimes there can be misunderstandings if you're not precise in how you communicate what you're saying. Um, and then there's also this kind of this self-fulfilling prophecy, which is this fear of being accused of not being even-handed. Well, you're talking to me about that. You must not be talking to somebody else about that, even if the employee doesn't even know that that's the case. So yeah, those are kind of some of the examples of why people are resistant to these things. But I think something that is coming to my mind as we talk about this is that um, sometimes we have clients who say, well, should we be doing these yearly reviews or should we be doing these kind of really informal things or what? And, I think our answer is yes, all, all of the above, do it all. You can have these informal coaching conversations. You can have somewhat more formal quarterly coaching conversations. You can have, um, you can have regular performance reviews. You can have kind of team meetings where you talk about what the whole team is doing. Um, and, importantly, document all of that, right? Write it down.
As a coach, I recommend all of the above. I agree. And also it's kind of, what fits with your organization. But at a minimum, quarterly coaching conversation with an annual review. I don't say you don't do an annual review, but that fourth quarterly coaching conversation turns into your annual review. If that's when you do your pay increases, then use that for that. But use those quarterly conversations to build up for that. And one of the things, Doug, while you were talking, I get the feeling that the conversation is around people that are inside an office staff. I think where this becomes even more important is when you have someone like a construction company. They've got 150 to 200 men and women in the field, and you've got 30 supervisors that are supervising employees. Typically, they're blue collar. Typically, they may not have had a college education. They've never been through any training like this. They don't know how to have those conversations, and well, they should just know how to do it. And they're really just that's what I used to do. I grew up that way. Why should I have to do that? And that's when you get into trouble. And so I think, and a lot of times, construction firms don't realize the most dangerous spot in the organization is those superintendents in the field. And because it's just difficult for them to do that, and they've not been trained to do that. And I think it's really imperative that organizations that have men and women in the field really focus on this because a lot of the litigation that I've seen comes from the field.
Yeah. Jennifer, that's a good segue to your input on training on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think our regular listeners are aware that we talk all the time about training, and we have a training platform that we've developed that really is intended to help supervisors with at least the employment law compliance piece of this, right? So understanding the law enough that you can recognize issues that need to be addressed from a compliance perspective, maybe shared with HR, escalated to higher management, whatever the appropriate action is. And also to I think appreciate, or I hope it helps people to appreciate just how important that supervisory role is, and that it is worth the time to do the things that, Mike, you're talking about. I think probably there's even additional training that would be very beneficial to, kind of learn the practical aspects of how to have these kinds of conversations, right? If you're somebody who says, I don't know that I know how to do that, I think I would say, I don't know that I'm the kind of person who really knows how to do that, right? But there's a way to get training to do that. As you were talking too, I was thinking about, practical tips and tricks, which I think we provide in some of our training, things like carry a notebook, right? For some of those on the fly, responding to an issue that's happening real time. That's a very easy way, and I found this helpful for me, to actually document that you had a conversation, what the issue was. It may be only a couple of lines, but it shows contemporaneous documentation. If you're doing a quarterly coaching conversation or the annual review, you can go back and look at your notes, and it helps you to recall what happened and when. So I think those are all the kinds of things that are helpful for supervisors to know. And as you pointed out, Mike, that the only way to know those things for a lot of people is to get training, because that isn't necessarily something people got taught in school when they were getting degrees and things like that. So training is definitely very important and something that we see a lot of value in for employers.
I think I was a business owner at one time, and I think the last thing a business owner wants to do sometimes is to pay for training. It's like, why do I need training? But if you look at it, you spend, a little bit of money on training, and if you can just avoid one lawsuit, one litigation, it pays for itself. And plus it makes a better organization. I think employees that work for an organization that sees that they're investing in that type of training, people like to work for companies like that, and I go back to the people issue. If you focus on taking care of your people will take care of you as an organization. It's those organizations that don't take care of their people, those are the ones that end up in a bad spot.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. So thank you to, again, Mike Taylor, TaylorMade Visioneering. He's an expert at helping business owners navigate growth and achieve their vision. Great input, great ideas on the quarterly coaching conversation, how to document, how to manage. And of course, as everybody knows here, we, as Jennifer touched on, we have a lot of training ideas. As we were talking, I pulled out our book that is available on Amazon, and we have 2 chapters that relate to these exact topics. So Jen and Doug have probably forgotten about these. These are at the very beginning of the book, but we have chapter 2 on what it means to be an at-will employee, chapter 3, why you need to document performance issues. These are some of the most key foundational issues every leader needs to know. And of course, we have a whole assortment of video, recorded content, and we do live training too. So that's it for today. Thanks for joining us on Ground Rules, and we'll see you next time.
Ground Rules hosts and guests are not providing legal advice in this podcast. Do not act upon any of the information discussed in this podcast without first consulting a licensed attorney.